So someone was asking me the other day why I haven't made a video yet on guitar collecting, the principles of guitar collecting, how to build a guitar collection, indeed how to understand this very complex, sometimes downright illogical market. And it struck me, yeah, maybe I should do it, right? I've of course shown all of you my collection over here in Singapore, but today it's going to be the video that a lot of you are asking for. Hi everyone, welcome back to the Ministry of Guitar. I'm Utkarsh coming to you from Singapore. As a lot of you know, I have about somewhere between 85 to 90 guitars. I did release a series of videos on the collections. If you want to see the collection, the videos are here, link wherever. But this video is going to talk to you about the basics of guitar collecting. I'm going to answer a few questions. Question number one is, what makes a guitar collectible, right? That's question number one. Because it's not always what you might think, and it works a little bit different from the market, say the watch market or the car market. These are two other specific hobbies that I can think of. The second one is, which brand of guitars are most collectible? I think a lot of you know the answer, but we will examine this a little bit more closely. Then the third thing is, what should any, and I'm putting this in heavy quotes, what should any decent collection contain? There is a basic template for a guitar collection. Of course, people do all sorts of collections, but there are a few staples that you need to have in any guitar collection, so we'll talk about that. The fourth one is, how can you get started collecting? And linked to that, how did I get started collecting? Right? And I could talk a little bit about few collection strategies. I'll tell you about mine. It's not really a strategy that I thought of, but it's something that I'm back deducing from what I have done. So let's start off with question number one. What makes a guitar collectible? Well, there are a few things that can make a guitar collectible. The first one is, who played a guitar similar to it or the same model. So a guitar model can be collectible if it was played by a famous person. The most collectible guitar out there, which is a vintage 1959 Gibson Les Paul, is so because that guitar was used by many famous rock musicians, Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, just to mention two, who then used it to help shape rock and roll music. So who played a guitar, or that actual guitar is of course a piece of memorabilia, very expensive, but a guitar model becomes very specifically collectible if it was played by a person. And the thing to realize is, it's the Gibson Les Paul is a guitar that has been sold since the 1950s till today. Not all Gibson Les Pauls are collectible. So things are divided by year, things are divided by spec, things are divided by many different things. So you have to look for a particular guitar. So for example, over there a 1959 Gibson Les Paul standard, which is much more collectible than a 1959 Gibson Les Paul custom, which is kind of strange because technically the custom is a more premium version of the standard. So you're already seeing how this thing gets illogical, but it makes sense because the standard was played by more famous players than the custom. So that's another way of looking at it. Another example of a collectible Gibson Les Paul, for example, would be, say, early 1970s Gibson Les Paul custom. Here the custom gets collectible versus the standard, because the custom was used by many players. Randy Rhoads, I have a 1974 Gibson Les Paul custom, same year as what Randy Rhoads used, a famous player. And then you have, of course, silver bursts, which Les Paul customs, which are also collectible because they were played by Adam Jones of Tool. So I've just gone through one particular kind of guitar, Gibson Les Paul here. I cannot go through everything, but that just shows you. And then there are two things. There is the actual guitar model, which was used by a famous player, and sometimes there are reissues. And sometimes these reissues also get very collectible. So there is a very famous guitar, a 1959 Les Paul called Greenie, that was used by multiple famous players. It was used by Peter Green from Fleetwood Mac, after whom it was named. Then it was used by Gary Moore. And now it's owned by Kirk Hammett of Metallica. Replicas of that guitar are very collectible. In fact, there was an original replica of that guitar made a few years ago that is even more collectible. So that's how it goes. So think of it being very associated with the player. That is one form of collectible guitar. The second form of collectible guitar is, what is the guitar made of? Are there particular woods that are used in it that make it special? This doesn't mean that you make any guitar from any special wood, it becomes collectible instantly. But a good example is Brazilian rosewood. So Brazilian rosewood is one of the iconic mythical tone woods. Tone wood basically means that wood is supposed to help give the guitar a great sound. It's more applicable for acoustic guitars, but that concept does extend to electric guitars as well. So Brazilian rosewood is a magical tone wood. It is even more magical because it's rare and it's illegal now. Illegal as in you can't get new Brazilian rosewood because it's classified the same as elephant ivory. But what you can get is Brazilian rosewood that was cut, say, in the 1960s. So some companies still have a stock of this very old Brazilian rosewood. So if you take Martin acoustic guitars, for example, the ones with the Brazilian rosewood back and sides are very collectible. If you take something more modern electric guitars, guitars with the Brazilian rosewood fretboard, Gibson guitars with Brazilian rosewood fretboards, or even more so, PRS guitars with Brazilian rosewood necks, of which I have quite a few right behind me. Modern Eagle 1, for example, it's a guitar that has a whole Brazilian rosewood neck that's supposed to give it a certain sound. That suddenly becomes collectible. So it's also about the kind of materials that the guitar is made from. It's also to do with quantities in which certain guitars are made. So certain guitars are made in very small quantities and they become very collectible, certain limited runs. There are certain things that happen. So for example, when it comes to Ibanez, you have certain paint jobs that are considered very collectible. There's a very particular, not even a paint job. Steve Vai, who created this Ibanez guitar called the Gem, there's a particular kind of guitar where he took his curtain fabric and he made a set of guitars having that curtain fabric as the floral. That's very collectible. And that's also very limited because it's only built during a few years in the late 80s, early 90s, so on and so forth. So that's another way a guitar gets collectible, right? So these are the two broad schemes. Sometimes they overlap. And it also depends on who is the flavor of the month, right? So, for example, what's happening right now is a lot of guitars that were played by 90s artists or 2000 artists suddenly becoming more collectible because suddenly the people who were fans of those artists when they were young, now they have the money to buy it. So you're seeing guitars, say somebody like Blink 182, guitars from played by players from that band as an example, getting more collectible. So it's really to do with the player and the material and the limited run. Now let's talk about which brands are the most collectible. Honestly, the answer is very simple. Gibson and Fender. These are the two most collectible brands because these are the two most iconic brands and they have been around since the beginning of rock and roll, and the history of the electric guitar is linked to the history of rock and roll. Not every Gibson is collectible, not every Fender is collectible. These are both mass manufacturers, they're still making multiple guitars, but iconic guitars linked to an artist, linked to a famous limited run, they remain collectible. That said, other brands are also collectible. PRS, which I am particularly, half of my collection is PRS, is another collectible brand, though you need to know again what you're looking for, certain limited runs. And there are other brands as well. Certain Ibanezes are collectible. Certain Musicmans are collectible. Very few. Gibson and Fender are really where it's at when it comes to collectability. I'm talking electric guitars here. Acoustic guitars, Martin is the OG. So certain Martins of a certain era are more collectible. Now, what kind of guitars are collectible also are vintage guitars. Not all vintage guitars, but again, guitars of a certain era. And it's a very interesting thing to see that when a guitar crosses a certain age and it's a certain kind of guitar, it suddenly goes up in value, right? So what used to be a second-hand guitar becomes vintage. And whenever a guitar crosses over from second-hand to vintage, it suddenly becomes more collectible. So for example, say 20 years ago, nobody cared about 1970s Gibsons or 1970s Fenders. They were considered quite bad. But the values have gone up dramatically because now a guitar from the 1970s is more than 50 years old. Suddenly it is collectible. So suddenly 1970s Gibsons are more collectible than what they were considered. So this is another thing to know. The brand and the age of the guitar that makes it collectible. What should any decent collection contain? This is a strange question, but I'm going to put it across because it's important to know. So there are certain templates of guitars that typically any collection should have, especially when to cover a lot of sounds and a lot of ground. You should definitely have a Fender Stratocaster in your collection. The Fender Strat is the archetypical electric guitar. There are many different kinds from all different prices. Even today, you can buy one for $200 or you can buy one for $20,000. That's the range. New. So a Fender Strat is always in the collection. It has a very particular sound. Next, it has to be the Gibson Les Paul, which is again one of the most iconic guitar brands. So that also is always there in the collection, has a particular sound. So you have a single coil guitar, Fender Strat, and Gibson Les Paul. That is the bare basic guitar collection. In fact, when I started, not that I was collecting, but when I had only a Les Paul, not a Gibson, but a Epiphone Les Paul, I got a Fender Strat. So I at least had the most basic. That is the most basic collection, a Strat and a Les Paul. Now you can expand to make the basic lineup of a Strat, a Les Paul, a Tele. A Tele is a Fender Telecaster. That is the original electric guitar, frankly speaking, the first mass electric guitar. That was the first mass produced one, famous one. So there's that. So a Fender Telecaster. So Strat, Tele, Les Paul. And then you get into potentially having a semi-hollow. The reason to have a semi-hollow guitar is it works really well for genres such as jazz, certain kind of instrumental genres, there's a very particular, very airy sound. The thing would be to have a ES335, a Gibson ES335 traditionally, but so you can probably do it with others. In fact, I don't have any Gibson ES335s in my collection. I just don't like them that much, but I have a lot of hollow body PRSs. In fact, the one hanging right there, that's a hollow body PRS with a spruce top. A very collectible guitar. We'll talk about that separately in some other video. So yeah, so basically Strat, Tele, Les Paul, hollow body, jazz kind of guitar, jazz box, and then a modern guitar. Now, modern guitar is a broad definition. Basically, it means you could have 24 frets, could have a tremolo, sometimes maybe a Floyd Rose, which is a more complicated tremolo. These 5 guitars is the bare basic that you should have in any decent collection, because between these guitars, you'll cover any sound pretty much. And any modern guitar examples are PRS Custom 24, any modern Ibanez that you can find with 24 frets and a tremolo. It doesn't necessarily need to have a tremolo, any Musicman. There are plenty of guitars that fall under this modern criteria. So that's the bare basic collection, and then you can expand from there. Now, in my particular case, and this is kind of getting into how can you get started collecting, how did I get started collecting? I had a strong preference for Les Pauls, which is more of the Gibson style of guitar. I did have a Strat, as I mentioned earlier, but I was really more into Les Pauls. And then I discovered a brand called PRS. And as it turns out, PRS makes a flavor of everything. It makes a kind of a Strat, it makes a kind of a Les Paul version. A lot of these companies, they make Gibson and Fender are the OGs. And everybody else kind of makes their versions of it, though many companies have established their own niche. Ibanez made its own niche, PRS made its own niche. So I really like what PRS does. PRS is all about super high quality. I was going to say they're like the Rolls Royce, but they're not really, because Rolls Royce is, I don't know if Rolls Royce is the highest quality car out there, but super high quality, super well built. Sound is a debate between a lot of people, but you can get pretty much any sound from any electric guitar. I've talked about this in other videos. So my collection focuses more on a lot of PRSs, a lot of rare PRSs, and a lot of PRSs model that I like. But for you, it can be completely your particular taste. Some people like odd-shaped guitars. I, for example, like the Explorer that you see hanging over there. I'm going to move my microphone a little bit so you see it better. So I have a lot of Explorer-shaped guitars in my collection because I like it. Some people have a full collection of Explorer-shaped guitars. It is a Gibson model, the Gibson Explorer, but other companies make it as well. Maybe you like the Flying V. Maybe you particularly like guitars that may be used for surf music. Surf music has a guitar used like a Jazz Master, Fender Jazz Master, Fender Jaguar. Maybe you like that, so your collection is full of that. So there is no hard and fast rule as such. The main thing to know is, I think it's important to either get something you really, really like, or get something that is very, very collectible. Buying anything else is a little bit of a waste of time, because those are difficult to sell, and if you don't really like it, what's the point? I don't mind buying certain guitars that are not collectible that I really, really like. I have a few of them. But it's no problem at all. Excuse me, just feeling a little warm here. It's no problem at all because, I like them. It doesn't matter that they're not collectible, not going up in value. But if I bought them just for the sake of having a collection and I don't really like them, it's a bit pointless. I do have some guitars that I have bought because the collectability factor of it is quite appealing to me. But I always buy something that I like. I never buy a guitar that I don't want to play, that I would just buy because it is collectible. For example, PRS had released a few models based on their Strat called the Silver Sky, and there are 2 or 3 models of them that are very collectible. And in fact, PRS also has this very collectible guitar called the Dragon, which has got dragon inlays. Now you would think it's a PRS, it's collectible. I had access to get some at very good prices. I would have jumped on them, but I didn't because I have no interest. I don't like the PRS Dragon as such. I find it difficult to play with all the inlays. Just my personal preference. And the Silver Sky PRS's version of a Strat doesn't appeal to me. For me, if I want a Strat, I'll just get a Strat, even though the PRS Strat is considered much better from a player's standpoint, just as an example. Another example for guitar that I did not collect is the David Gilmour Strat. David Gilmour is my favorite guitarist. His original black Strat is the most expensive guitar ever sold. So there's a Fender custom shop version of it. I had access to get one many, many times, but I never got it because I was like, the only reason that guitar appeals to me is because David Gilmour plays something like it, but the specs of the guitar are all wrong for what I like. For example, it has a fretboard that is less easy to bend. Ironic given how much David Gilmour bends compared to what I like. So I never got it. So what I'm trying to tell you is that you don't have to feel any pressure when you're trying to build a guitar collection. Just buy what you like. Make sure you're getting it at a reasonable price. If you're being actively trying to be a collector, keep an eye on the potential future value, things like that, potential runs made. That's all you need to do. Just don't buy anything just because it's on sale or just because you want that sudden dopamine hit. That's the only advice that I would give you. All right, folks, I hope this was interesting to you. At least you got a basic idea of guitar collecting. And of course, if you want to know more about guitar collecting, want to know more about my collection, there are plenty of videos on this channel. All right, I'll see you next time.